Chapter 5 of Malcolm Sage Detective by Herbert George Jenkins. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Inspector Wensdale is surprised. 1. Nearly a month had elapsed, and the cattle maiming mystery seemed as far off solution as ever. The neighbourhood in which the crimes had been committed had once more settled down to its usual occupations, and Scotland Yard had followed suit. Sir John Hackblock had written to the Chief Commissioner, and a question had been asked in the House. Inspector Wensdale's colleagues had learned that it was dangerous to mention in his presence the words cattle or maiming. The inspector knew that the affair was referred to as Wensdale's Waterloo, and his failure to throw light on the mystery was beginning to tell upon his nerves. For 3 weeks he had received no word from Malcolm Sage. One morning, on his arrival at Scotland Yard, he was given a telephone message asking him to call round at the bureau during the day. "Nothing new?" queried Malcolm Sage 10 minutes later, as the inspector was shown into his room by Thompson. The inspector shook a gloomy head and dropped his heavy frame into a chair. Malcolm Sage indicated with a nod that Thompson was to remain. "Can you borrow a couple of covered government lorries?" queried Malcolm Sage. "A couple of hundred, if necessary," said the inspector dully. "2 will be enough," was the dry rejoinder. "Now listen carefully, Wensdale. I want you to have 50 men housed some 10 miles away from Hempdon on the afternoon of the 22nd. Select men who've done scouting, ex-Boy Scouts for preference. Don't choose any with bald heads or with very light hair. See that they are wearing dark clothes and dark shirts, and, above all, no white collars. Take with you a good supply of burnt cork, such as is used by nigger minstrels." Malcolm Sage paused, and for the fraction of a second there was a curious fluttering at the corners of his mouth. Inspector Wensdale was sitting bolt upright in his chair, gazing at Malcolm Sage as if he had been requested to supply 2 lorry loads of archangels. "It will be moonlight, and caps might fall off," explained Malcolm Sage. "You cannot very well ask a man to black his head. Above all," he continued evenly, "be sure you give no indication to any one why you want the man, and tell them not to talk. You follow me?" he queried. "Yes," said the inspector. I follow." "Don't go down Hempdon way again, and tell no one in the neighbourhood. No one, you understand, is to know anything about it. Don't tell the General, for instance." "Him?" There was a world of hatred and contempt in the inspector's voice. Then he glanced a little oddly at Malcolm Sage. Malcolm Sage went on to elaborate his instructions. The men were to be divided into 2 parties, one to form a line north of the scene of the last outrage, and the other to be spread over a particular zone some 3 miles the other side of Hempdon. They were to blacken their faces and hands, and observe great care to show no light colouring in connection with their clothing. Thus they would be indistinguishable from their surroundings. "You will go with one lot," said Malcolm Sage to the inspector, "and my man Finlay with the other. Thompson and I will be somewhere in the neighbourhood. You will be given a password for purposes of identification. You understand?" "I think so," said the inspector, in a tone which was suggestive that he was very far from understanding. "I'll have everything typed out for you, and scale plans of where you are to post your men. Above all, don't take anyone into your confidence." Inspector Wensdale nodded and looked across at Thompson, as if to assure himself that after all it really was not some huge joke. "If nothing happens on the 22nd, we shall carry on the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th nights. In all probability we shall catch our man on the 23rd." "Then you know who it is?" spluttered the inspector in astonishment. "I hope to know on the 23rd," said Malcolm Sage dryly, as he rose and walked towards the door. Directness was his strong point. Taking the hint, Inspector Wensdale rose also and, with the air of a man not yet quite awake, passed out of the room. "You had better see him tomorrow, Thompson," said Malcolm Sage, "and explain exactly how the men are to be disposed. Make it clear that none must show themselves. If they actually see anyone in the act, they must track him, not try to take him." Thompson nodded his head comprehendingly. "Make it clear that they are there to watch. But I doubt if they'll see anything," he added. 2. At 11 o'clock on the night of July the 23rd, Two motor lorries glided slowly along some 3 miles distant from one another. From their interiors, silent forms dropped noiselessly on to the moon-white road. A moment later, slipping into the shadow of the hedge, they disappeared. All the previous night men had watched and waited, but nothing had happened. Now they were to try again. Overhead the moon was climbing the sky, struggling against masses of cloud that from time to time swung themselves across her disk. In the village of Hampden all was quiet. The last light had been extinguished, the last dog had sent forth a final challenging bark, hoping that some neighbouring rival would answer and justify a volume of canine protest. On the western side of the highway, and well behind the houses, two figures were standing in the shadow cast by a large oak. Their faces and hands were blackened, rendering them indistinguishable from their surroundings. One wore a shade over a pair of gold-rimmed spectacles, a precaution against the moonlight being reflected on the lenses. Half an hour and a half passed. They waited. Presently one gripped the arm of the other and pointed. At the back of the house, immediately opposite, there was a slight movement in the shade cast by a hedge. Then the line readjusted itself and the shadow vanished. A moment later it reappeared in a patch of moonlight, looking like a large dog. Stooping low, Malcolm Sage and Thompson followed the dog-like form, themselves taking advantage of every patch of shadow and cover that offered. The mysterious form moved along deliberately and without haste, now disappearing in the shadow cast by some tree or bush, now reappearing once more on the other side. It was obviously taking advantage of everything that tended to conceal its movements. Once it disappeared altogether, and for 5 minutes the two trackers lay on their faces and waited. "Making sure he's not being followed," whispered Thompson, and Malcolm Sage nodded. Presently the figure appeared once more and, as if reassured, continued its slow and deliberate way. Once a dog barked, a short, sharp bark of uncertainty. Again there was no sign of the figure for some minutes. Then it moved out from the surrounding shadows and continued its stealthy progress. Having reached the outskirts of the village, it continued its crouching course along the western side of the hedge, flanking the roadside. Malcolm Sage and Thompson followed under the shadow of a hedge running parallel. For a mile the slow and laborious tracking continued. Suddenly Malcolm Sage stopped. In the field on their right two horses were grazing in the moonlight. It was the scene of the tragedy of the month previous. For some minutes they waited expectantly. Suddenly Malcolm Sage gripped Thompson's arm and pointed. From under the hedge a dark patch was moving slowly towards the nearer of the two animals. It was apparently the form of a man, face downwards, wriggling along inch by inch without bending a limb. "Get across. Cut off his retreat," whispered Sage. "Look out for the knife." Thompson nodded and slid away under cover of the hedge separating the field in which the horses were from that along which the watchers had just passed. Slowly the form approached its quarry. Once the horse lifted its head as though scenting danger, but the figure was approaching upwind. Suddenly it raised itself, appearing once more like a large dog. Then, with a swift, panther-like movement, it momentarily disappeared in the shadow cast by the horse. There was a muffled scream and a gurgle as the animal collapsed, then silence. A minute later the form seemed to detach itself from the carcass and wriggle along towards the hedge, a dark patch upon the grass. Malcolm Sage was already half-way through the second field, keeping well under the shelter of the hedge. He reached a spot where the intersecting hedge joined that running parallel with the high road. There was a hole sufficiently large for a man to crawl through from one field to the other. By this Malcolm Sage waited, a life-preserver in his hand. At the sound of the snapping of a twig he gripped his weapon. A moment later a round, dark shape appeared through the hole in the hedge. Without hesitating Malcolm Sage struck. There was a sound, half grunt, half sob, and Malcolm Sage was on his feet, gazing down at the strangest creature he had ever encountered. Clothed in green, its face and hands smeared with some pigment of the same colour, lay the figure of a tall man. Round the waist was a belt from which was suspended, in its case, a Gurkha's kukri. Malcolm Sage bent down to unbuckle the belt. He turned the man on his back. As he did so, he saw that in his hand was a small, collapsible tin cup covered with blood, which also stained his lips and chin, and dripped from his hands, whilst the front of his clothing was stained in dark patches. "I wonder who he is," muttered Thompson, as he gazed down at the strange figure. "Locally he is known as the Reverend Geoffrey Callis," remarked Malcolm Sage quietly, and Thompson whistled. 3. "And that damned scoundrel has been fooling us for 2 years!" Sir John Hackblock glared at Inspector Wensdale as if it were he who was responsible for the deception. They were seated smoking in Sir John's library after a particularly early breakfast. "I always said it was the work of a madman," said the inspector in self-defence. "Callice is no more mad than I am," snapped Sir John. "I wish I were going to try him," he added grimly. "The scoundrel! To think—" His indignation choked him. "He is not mad in the accepted sense," said Malcolm Sage, as he sucked meditatively at his pipe. "I should say that it is a case of race memory." "Race memory? Damn it, what's that?" Sir John Hackblock snapped out the words in his best parade ground manner. He was more purple than ever about the jowl, and it was obvious that he was prepared to disagree with everyone and everything. As Lady Hackblock and her domestics would have recognised without difficulty, Sir John was angry. "How the devil did you spot the brute?" he demanded, as Malcolm Sage did not reply immediately. "Race memory," he remarked, ignoring the question, "is to man what instinct is to animals. It defies analysis or explanation." Sir John stared, but it was Inspector Wensdale who spoke. "But how did you manage to fix the date, Mr. Sage?" he enquired. "By the previous outrages," was the reply. "The previous outrages?" cried Sir John. "Damn it! How did they help you?" "They all took place about the time the moon was at the full. There were 28 in all." Malcolm Sage felt in his pocket and drew out a paper. "These are the figures." In his eagerness, Sir John snatched the paper from his hand, and with Inspector Wensdale looking over his shoulder, read: "Day before full moon, 4. Full moon, 15. Day after, 7. Second day after, 2. Total, 28. "Well, I'm damned!" exclaimed Sir John, looking up from the paper at Malcolm Sage as if he had solved the riddle of the universe. The inspector's only comment was a quick indrawing of breath. Sir John continued to stare at Malcolm Sage, the paper still held in his hand. "That made matters comparatively easy," continued Malcolm Sage. "The outrages were clearly not acts of revenge upon any particular person, for they involved 9 different owners. They were obviously the work of someone subject to a mania, or obsession, which gripped him when the moon was at the full." "But how did you fix the actual spot?" burst out Inspector Wensdale excitedly. "Each of the previous acts had been either in a diametrically opposite direction from that immediately preceding it, or practically on the same spot. For instance, the first 3 were north, east, and south of Hampton, in the order named. Then the cunning of the perpetrator prompted him to commit a 4th, not to the west, but to the south, within a few yards of the previous act. The criminal argued, probably subconsciously, that he would be expected to complete the square." "But what made you fix on Hampton as the headquarters of the blackguard?" enquired Sir John. "That was easy," remarked Malcolm Sage, polishing the thumbnail of his left hand upon the palm of his right. "Easy?" The exclamation burst involuntarily from the inspector. "You supplied me with a large scale map showing the exact spot where each of the previous maimings had taken place. I drew a square to embrace the whole. Lines drawn diagonally from corner to corner gave me the centre of gravity." "But—" began the inspector. Ignoring the interruption, Malcolm Sage continued. "A man committing a series of crimes from a given spot was bound to spread his operations over a fairly wide area in order to minimize the chance of discovery. The longer the period and the larger the number of crimes, the greater the chance of his being located somewhere near the centre of his activities." "Well, I'm damned!" remarked Sir John for the second time. Then, suddenly turning to Inspector Wensdale, "Damn it!" he exploded. "Why didn't you think of that?" "There was, of course, the chance of his striking in another direction," continued Malcolm Sage, digging into the bowl of his pipe with a penknife. "So I placed the man in such a way that if he did so, he was bound to be seen." Inspector Wensdale continued to gaze at him, eager to hear more. "But what was that you said about race memory?" Sir John had quieted down considerably since Malcolm Sage had begun his explanation. "I should describe it as a harking back to an earlier phase. It is to the mind what atavism is to the body. In breeding, for instance," Malcolm Sage looked across to Sir John, you find that an offspring will manifest characteristics, or a taint, that is not to be found in either sire or dam." Sir John nodded. "Well, race memory is the same thing in regard to the mental plane, a sort of subconscious wave of reminiscence. In Callus's case it was in all probability the memory of some sacrificial rite of his ancestors centuries ago." "A case of heredity?" "Broadly speaking, yes. At the full moon this particular tribe whose act Callus has reproduced was in the habit of slaughtering some beast or beasts and drinking the blood, probably with the idea of absorbing their strength or their courage. Possibly the surroundings at Hempdon were similar to those where the act of sacrifice was committed in the past. It must be remembered that Callus was an ascetic and consequently highly subjective. Therefore, when the wave of reminiscence is taken in conjunction with the surroundings, the full moon and his high state of subjectivity, it is easy to see that material considerations might easily be obliterated. That is why I watched the back entrance to his lodgings." "And all the time we were telling him our plans," murmured the inspector half to himself. "Yes, and he would go out hunting himself," said Sir John. "Damn funny, I call it. Anyway, he'll get 7 years at least." "When he awakens he will remember nothing about it. You cannot punish a man for a subconscious crime." Sir John snorted indignantly, but Inspector Wensdale nodded his head slowly and regretfully. "Anyway, I owe you £500, said Sir John to Malcolm Sage. "And damn it, it's worth it," he added. Malcolm Sage shrugged his shoulders as he rose to go. "I was sorry to have to hit him," he said regretfully, "but I was afraid of that knife. A man can do a lot of damage with a thing like that. That's why I told you not to let your men attempt to take him, Wensdale." "How did you know what sort of a knife it was?" asked the inspector. "Oh, I motored down here and the car broke down. Incidentally, I made a lot of acquaintances, including Callus's patrol leader, a bright lad. He told me a lot of things about Callus and his ways. A remarkable product, the Boy Scout," he added. "Kipling calls him the friend of all the world." Sir John looked across at Inspector Wensdale, who was strongly tempted to wink. "Don't think too harshly of Callus," said Malcolm Sage, as he shook hands with Sir John. "It might easily have been you or I, had we been a little purer in mind and thought." And with that he passed out of the room, with Inspector Wensdale followed by Sir John Hackblock, who was endeavouring to interpret the exact meaning of the remark. "They said he was a clever devil," he muttered as he returned to the library after seeing his guests off. "And damn it, they were right." End of chapter 5.